first program for today is a debate with some very cool people. Our very own activists and democracy experts are with us here today at Nyt Europa, where we're going to talk about fundamental rights under pressure in Europe, and of course what we could do to fight those backlash of democracy we see across our continent. Today we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to have some inputs from our panel here, but we're also going to have like a brief explanation about why we are in this dome at all by our European partners from European public spheres. We're going to talk a bit about the Democracy Dome. My name is Lea Fridberg. I'm a project leader at Nyt Europa, working with democracy, civic space, etc. in Europe. And I'm very happy to be here today to have this debate with you guys. During the week we have a lot of talk about civic space, about activism, about democracy, what's going on right now in Hungary, Poland, but also other places in Europe where we can see there are some attacks on our civic rights, and we see a shrinking civil space as a continuing issue. So we're so happy to have this opportunity to talk to you guys as well today about that, because our hope today is that you will also join the conversation about what we could do actively to support our democracy champions in Europe. So I hope you're ready for that. Yeah?
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you guys. Amazingly. Now before we dive into this discussion today, I think I'm going to briefly give the microphone to our partner, Anne from European Public Sphere. And maybe Anne, you could tell us a bit about what on earth is this? Why are we here? And what's your project? What the meaning behind the Democracy Dome that is traveling throughout Europe? And then I know you're going to talk a bit about the Schuman Declaration as well. Please tell me what that is.
So hi everyone, my name is Anne Hart, and I work at an NGO, a German-based NGO called Democracy International. And in 2017 we actually started this project with the Dome, and basically my job is to travel across Europe to public places, set up the Dome and host spontaneous discussions of people who usually wouldn't meet under it. And we always discuss issues relevant to the future of Europe. So what should Europe look like? What do we want as citizens for the future of Europe, to bridge this divide between citizens and politics, but also to really get active as citizens and bring in our ideas, and to profit from this wealth of ideas that we as citizens have across Europe. So I think that's really the main idea of this dome. And this year we're on a very special tour that's co-funded by the program Europe for Citizens of the European Union itself. And the tour is called Remember, because we are going to 6 different places of remembrance in 6 European countries. And inspired by the past, we want to think about solutions for the future. So why are we doing this special tour? It's because we're celebrating 70 years of the Schuman Declaration, which French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman held on the 9th of May 1950, which is also why we're still celebrating Europe Day every year on that day. And what did he actually, or what did this declaration entail? So he suggested the creation of the European coal and steel community, which probably, as most of you know, later developed in today's European Union. So really something important, the starting point of our European Union, and that only 5 years after the end of World War II. So really an important thing to celebrate. I think that's it from my side. Now we'll have a short introduction on this place of remembrance here with the Dome, and I'm looking forward to that.
Could you just give the names for the 5 other places?
Yes, of course, I'm very happy to. So we started in Germany at the border museum Schifflersgrund, which was at the former inner German border. So a great place to discuss about freedom, about unity, all of these issues. Then we went to Bucharest, And it was at University Square in Bucharest where a lot of demonstrations around the democratic transition of the country took place. After that, Burgas in Bulgaria. And there we were at the Expo Flora Center. So there used to be a Flora exposition. Now they turned the place into still an exhibition center, but also a place for citizens to meet. And they also told us about how the park was one of the few secret and safe places to also foster the democratic transition in the country and really spark it. It was actually Burgas was the place where the democratic transition started in Bulgaria. Now we're here as the fourth stop. And after this, we're still going to Warsaw, and we will also go to Prague in September and October. And then it's already the end of our tour. And something that I would also like to mention, so we're collecting all of your ideas and we'll analyze them to create a catalog of ideas from the 6 countries we're going to. And at the end of the project, next year, around Europe Day, we will hand over this catalog to European decision makers. Yep. That's it.
Wow.
Thank you, Anne. Can you just a short... Thank you so much. And about collecting, Nina will hand out this little board so we can collect your signatures, so we can prove that you have all been here and contributed to the European conversation around democracy. And we're also going to film this, and let me know if you don't want to be filmed. We're going to make sure that you're not in a camera angle, hopefully. But otherwise, let's just have a great conversation. Yeah. And you're welcome to ask questions throughout this conversation if you want to. If you have any ideas, you want to give your inputs, please share them. This is really about having the citizen being heard today. So I love what you talked about history, about remembrance, about the democratic transition in Europe, because in New Europe, New Europa, we have been working with exactly those points. We have this project called History of Optimism, where we for the last year, a couple of years actually, Corona makes 1 year doesn't count in my head, but I guess it happened. We've been traveling around Europe to talk with people about the time from the fall of the wall, Berlin Wall, in 1989, and until the time of the European enlargement in 2004. And what happened in that time, and what can we learn from that? What can we bring with us from that we've learned from that time for the crises that we face today? Because what happened in those days was really magnificent. It was really a testament to the importance of civil society, how when you organize, you're able to claim your space, but also to actually create democracies. And I think that's really a great lesson to take with us today. But as you, Jakob Erle, also know, you're part of our democracy group in New York. We have been discussing this a lot. What also happened during this time, after you had the European enlargement, you had a big conversation about what rights and values should you take with you to be a part of the European community. When countries like Poland and Hungary became members of the European Union, they have to sign the Copenhagen criteria, and I think that's a great place to discuss this here in Copenhagen, where you have to sign on actually agreeing with the European values, the fundamental rights, because Europe, as we know today, is not just about trade, it's also about being a community of democratic countries fighting for those values. But Jakob Erle, you are what I would call a democracy nerd. I hope that's okay.
Yes, anything you say is okay.
Okay, wow, okay, watch out with that. And you also work in New Europe. I have been doing that a lot. I have been working with democracy in your professional life. In your own opinion, or in your own words, what is happening right now in Europe, and why do you see that as a challenge?
A lot of things are happening. Earlier today, I heard in the radio a professor of law discussing what happens with the expected stream of refugees that will come, some of them to Europe. And he described clearly the effort to make sure that nobody would get near any European border. Because the second someone comes to the European border or 5 meters inside any member country's border, then the European legislation kicks in. And the European legislation that kicks in says that then you have to treat people like someone with rights, for instance, the right to claim that you're a refugee. And then it becomes costly, difficult, complicated. So therefore, the European Union member countries, some much more than others, are very preoccupied with making one thing sure, that these people never get close to the border, so we don't have to follow our rules because they are not there. And I would say that the biggest challenge is not our rules. Actually, if you read them, they are very much okay. Very much. I would like to add just one thing. I saw this one saying from people power to direct democracy. And then I think, yes, okay, I'm all for direct democracy, but I'm just as much for representative democracy and all the other kinds, and they go together, and we don't want one to be there instead of the others. So I think what we really need, what is lacking, is the will to enforce and follow the rules.
And diving into that, because right now we see in Europe that even though we have these shared values, we have these shared laws and regulations that we have to follow, we have the fundamental rights that's in the center of all that. We also see membership countries actively trying to avoid or attacking those fundamental rights. And the EU as an institution have a really hard time actually responding to that in a proper way. Now you're also talking about this pressure of being a united European Union and how to respond to the crisis we see in the world right now today.
Yes, of course. The foreign policy, the aid policy, and all these, and the challenge of that is that when these rules are made, good people get together, well prepared, and then they make the proper rules, the proper decisions about how things should be. But when they then get to creating the tools to make sure they happen and make sure that we can intervene when it doesn't happen, then all the heads of government start, no, we don't want the European Union to do that, we will do that. So we have something which is almost perfect in terms of its aims, rules, regulations, and so on. But then when we have when somebody don't follow the rules, then fundamentally it moves to the national states and their 27 different ways of doing things.
Yeah. So we have this to condescend it. We have these issues with having a European Union, but also having, of course, member states, 27 member states that have to obey by those rules that we have decided. And if they don't, we have a really hard time responding to that. Now, Marek, I wanted to turn to you as well. You have to share the mic. We share. This is a great example of giving each other a voice. Right? Yeah, that's great.
That's right.
And now, Marek, you are an activist. You're a young activist as well. You're active in Nyt Europa, Minu Denmark, many other places. Would you just shortly introduce yourself, just with everything you do?
Everything I do. Okay. Then do you have to until tomorrow? So yes, I'm an activist, and I actually started just after public school, learning a little bit about the European Union in a role-play game at the Danish Parliament, where we had to act as politicians from the different members countries, and it was so interesting. And being in the most powerful place, I told myself, in Denmark at the parliament, where the politicians you look at on TV, they behave and walk around, and we were there, but we were not discussing Danish politics. I was 15 years old, and I had no clue what the European Union was. But I had to read about another country I've never been in, and act as I was the minister of trade, and then discuss with other young people, and it was super interesting. After this, they asked me, "Do you want to be a volunteer?" And I told myself, okay, what is that about? And little after little, I learned that the civil society is just about asking questions, but being also in a forum where it's okay to be whoever you are. So I don't study political science. I don't study anything like that. I was not in a political party, but I was discussing European politics. I was learning about youngsters in other countries, and it was so nice. I felt like my voice was heard just being in an organization with other young people. And we were 10, from like 15 years old to 25. It was some span in the group, but we agreed to do this the next year again and again and again and again. So I joined Nyt Europa, that also focuses on climate issues, sustainable development goals, European affairs, and then I'm in Mino Denmark, that focuses on minority rights, and especially for youth. And there's an intersection between the two, that whatever right you discuss, you need to have the intersectional perspective, you need to have the perspective about privilege, and understand the different backgrounds, that we don't necessarily have the same barriers to reach those platforms where we can discuss. So right now here in the Democracy Dome, I would love to travel to the other places. It sounds amazing. But it's actually a privilege that we can be here and have this conversation.
Yeah. And as a young activist, we just heard about the importance of civil society early on in creating European democracy and the European Union, but we also hear about the challenges it faces on a national level, and with the democratic backlash in Europe and EU's struggling to react to the current state of affairs in international politics. Now, why, as a young activist with a lot of energy, with a lot of will to change things, why would you invest your time in European affairs?
So for me, the European level is like one of the best examples of cooperation, and I believe that many of the struggles we are facing, we cannot solve them alone. And we see that with a tendency, especially among the youth, that when a protest movement is global, it's also viral, it goes fast, it's on Instagram, social media, we share it like for an instant, and then it's global. So somehow I believe that many young people, they are like the first movers, but I think they're afraid of demanding change in the international level. We are like not necessarily reflected in this system because they talk with another language. If you look at the members of parliament, the average age, they're somewhat, I'm sorry not to offend anybody here, but they're old. It was for the first time in the last election that there was actually a Danish MEP only 21 years old. Exactly. And that was the first time working with European affairs for 10 years that I saw somebody who was like young, but also talking on a more like eye height level, that you can that you can see yourself in. So right now there's a lot of change and issues, and in the European level, I think that inequality in Northern and Southern Europe, that is something that we can change together, but only if we understand.
So we also have now a young generation perhaps being more globally aware, because you also navigate on social media, which is per default also transnational in a sense. But I think this issue of representation is especially important to talk about here today at the Pride in this Democracy Dome. And Jakob, we just wrote a new report in New Europe focusing on democracy in Europe, basically civil society, the issues they're facing right now. But you also contributed with a very interesting chapter on representative democracy in the EU, and talking a bit about how to perhaps secure that people want to be engaged. We also have to give them a voice in the democracy as well. Can you please tell us briefly a recap of your chapter? Why do you think it's important to talk about representative democracy in the EU?
Well, this started with you asking me to write an article about deliberative democracy. No, that's okay. And then I was thinking about it, and then I thought I don't want to write an article about deliberative democracy, because deliberative democracy, yes, that's okay. But like I said before, we need all the others simultaneously, and we cannot exchange. They work together. They are not each other's competition. And if we go to the treaties, paragraph 11, or part 11, then you actually have where you have the. It's very nicely described, and there's a lot about deliberative democracy there already, but there's no deliberation. It doesn't happen. So at the end of this article, I wrote a suggestion that the European Union invests heavily. I have a present and a past as a Folkemøde director, teacher, working with the discussion between people and power, and we need that dialogue to go on. So my suggestion is that the European Union invests heavily in all local places in having a presence where it's possible to discuss the impact of European legislation in this place, rooted. I think that's the most important thing, not to change any treaties, not to change the basic setup. Do two things. One is this: create a place where you can actually discuss what the impact is, and get people's suggestions back, so you have a dialogue going. The other, that is making sure that every time we make new rules, that we have enforcement. So if people, organizations, or governments don't follow the rules, then we will have a procedure to make sure that happens, or a democratic decision about changing the rules.
Yeah. And I think that taps into actually what you were talking about, Marek. Maybe as a young person, you're not sure on how to influence what's going on in the EU. I mean, this is an interesting tool, of course, because it is transnational and it deals with transnational issues like climate, like inequality, like youth unemployment, that is very much relevant for your generation as well. But perhaps you need an outlet to actually talk about it and participate in it.
Yeah, because I think that what the European Union does, there's something called the Youth Dialogue, where they structurally invite young people all across the European Union once every 6 months for youth conference. So these youth conference, I've been actually I had the chance to go, but unfortunately it was online because of COVID, so we didn't meet in person. But we had the chance to discuss with other young people with different realities, because me as a student here in Denmark, I have a job. It's not that difficult to get a job. But talking with Spanish students, other countries like Greece, they have a whole different reality, and we have different welfare systems and regulation, and that is important to talk. The only problem about these youth conferences is that for 4 days we only had 30 minutes talking with decision makers, and that is not enough at all. Even though our recommendations goes to the EU Commission and then after to the Council, but then what? What about the people that works in the EU Commission and the people in the Council? They're much older. How can they understand what our wishes would be for the future of Europe?
That makes sense. But I kind of want to ask both of you, why is this important? Like, why is representation and having different perspective in the democratic debate in Europe even important? Like, don't we have politicians for that stuff?
Well, exactly. That was the problem about representation in the political system, and who has like the means and the resources to go to the politicians. I would argue that nobody after this conversation would pick up the phone, call politicians, and be like, "This is my wishes for the future." But we can, and we actually can email. But I believe that is the problem, that now there's a huge barrier to the decision makers, and that is why representation and continuing on demanding our voices to be heard, but not only heard. That is the problem. We need the dialogue with decision makers.
I would just like to interject also that it's very nice that these meetings are arranged and maybe a little is heard, but basically it's a token, and a token only. Depending on the definition, there are maybe 100 million young people in Europe. And, well, it's nice that they listen to you for 30 minutes. But what about, and maybe they listen to 2,000 other people, but what about the other 90,998,000? If this is going to work and be functional and credible, then it needs to have a presence where all the 100 million have access to direct information and can ask questions, and also, if they have ideas, can come with them. So it's needed to have another kind of system as well.
As you as an activist and a young activist, how do you think you can involve other youngsters? Because it's not easy. I can imagine. Like, it's not all youngsters who want to dedicate themselves to activism. How would you do it?
So for me, activism as a term, for me it's as simple as it can begin with a question. So it's not necessarily reading a report, jumping to conclusions and call to actions, organizing events with a huge network of different volunteering organizations. But it can also like be a question and then a response. If there's just a person who listens and can pass on the message and the wishes to be heard. So structurally, I think that youth are becoming a much bigger global movement and has new ways of organizing and new ways of campaigning for their demands and wishes, and that is something very, very good for the future. And we've seen it already with global movements, but here in Europe, the problem is that today it's Friday, and tonight, after maybe a couple of beers or two, I won't start a conversation about the EU and how the political system can be changed in order to include more young people's voices, because it's not easy to start that dialogue. So for me, we go to schools and meet the young people where they are already in the educational systems, and we did a survey to 10,200 young people in Europe. So that is still not enough, but that was some kind of data that we collected, and we did qualitative interviews. And if we have to do that every 6 months, where does the results go? That is my problem. So I want to still criticize, even though being a part of the youth dialogue, we need to criticize it. As a young activist, it's just important to keep on the fight and insisting on raising concern about the political system in Europe, because it actually, on the paper, it does include you. And there's also the Citizens Initiative that you can collect signatures, 100 million signatures, no, 1 million. In 7 countries, 1 million signatures. Then the European Parliament has to take in the proposal. Yeah.
And discuss it.
Yeah.
I actually thought it was quite interesting. What we saw in Poland recently during the demonstration for the right to abortion for women was that we saw hundreds of thousands of people walking in the street. Most of those people were young, and they were actually also carrying the European Union's flag with the blue flag with the stars as a symbol for the values that they thought that they wanted to be represented in their own country, more on a European level. In Denmark, I don't see that conversation as much. I mean, we've seen it in Poland, we've seen it in Hungary, we've seen it in Slovenia, where young activists claim Europe much more than they do today in Denmark. What do you think is the reason for that?
I think we take it for granted that we're part of the European Union. The young people is a generation that is used to it, but actually we don't know enough about the basic rights that we're used to as a concrete product of being a member of the European Union. When we can travel, the Erasmus Plus program, I would believe that many talk about like, oh, I want to do an Erasmus exchange, and has no clue that it's a part of the European Union. It has been fought for. It's about the youth policy, and there's so many great results of this that we are taking for granted. And that is not only it. It's also about how difficult it is to jump to solutions. Like if we discuss local politics, then it's easy to go from A to C. If you want to like, how can I demand change? But how do I demand change in the European Union setting? That is complicated.
It is. But I also want to ask both of you, do you think there's a generational issues at stake here? Do you think perhaps, Erle, your generation saw the fall of the Berlin Wall in 18... I'm sorry, I'm not sure how old you are, but I'm sure you remember it. I'm not sure how old you are, but I'm sure you remember it. 1989. And of course the Eastern enlargement, whereas Marek and I, we kind of grew up with that. Like we take, as you said, most of these democratic progress for granted, and the European Union as a status quo in somewhat. I mean, I think the Brexit was a shock to everyone, but do you think there's a generational issue at stake here about how you wish to engage in the European debate?
No, not really. I think we are all equally terrible. And I think at the time when the wall fell, I was very much against the EU. I thought it was a very bad idea because I basically thought it was the conspiracy of the rich against the poor, both internally and especially externally, the conspiracy of the rich countries against the poor countries.
And then what happened?
Then, well, the Berlin Wall fell, and I started worrying about structure, because what happened after the Berlin Wall's fall was the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and basically politically our world was organized by having two capitals, one in Moscow and one in Washington, and they would fight each other, but somehow it would also create a clear structure. Suddenly anything could happen. and some of it could be good, but some of it certainly could be very bad, as we know from history. So I thought, okay, we better get organized and keep the kind of organization we have. And then just one thing about this thing with the absence of EU flags in Denmark. When we joined after the referendum in 72 and 73, the Danish political class was very busy saying this has nothing to do with values, politics, or anything else. It's only about getting richer. And when the British go into the European Union, we can't sell the bacon anymore, so that's a big problem. And somehow I think we still have the same sort of thinking going, that this is more about market than it's about freedoms.
So more about bacon than values.
But what people sometimes don't understand is that these two go together, that you cannot have the market without the values, because then the market will not work. And I think when you see the blue flags with the yellow stars in Poland, it's because it's a tool in the fight for certain rights, which is good. I saw it. I spent 4 years in Egypt during the Arab Spring. Even there you would see EU flags once in a while, and they would come, and you see them in Afghanistan as well. So you see them as a pointer to the rights and to somebody to help us maintain the rights, which I think is okay, but it comes up only when it's useful.
And as an example, lately also the COVID situation, that was like one of the first time I saw like decision makers in the EU actually taking care of something that was a global issue and reacting quite fast, and almost faster than on a national level, because there was a whole system organized for handling this. And that was where I was, this will become historically something I can refer to as like the ideal, not the ideal, because there will always be criticism to raise, but at least as something where they reacted. And I hope that global crisis will become like this in the future, then we can collaborate rather than closing in and seeing they can take care of it themselves.
So yeah, we have another question from the audience. I know, Marek, perhaps you could give him.
Hi, thank you for a very nice presentation. I'm not an activist, I'm just a European citizen, you can say. So I am a Greek living in Denmark. We had a referendum to leave the EU around 10 years ago during the financial crisis, and we voted to leave. How democracy works, we didn't leave, we stayed into the EU. So it was a financial decision that overcame the will of the people. It is irrelevant if we believe in the EU ideals or values, people voted to leave at the EU. So I go back to the points that you were making around the north of Europe and the south of Europe, and the big divisions that exist also within Europe. For example, in the south, when I hear people speaking about Europe, there's a big mistrust towards this big institution that can be idealized on one level. Another level has been very slow to respond to European crises, where it involves also the people that are part of Europe. So how do we engage youth is a very, very important question, because Europe is an abstract concept, you can say, on one level. On another level, it is a series of policies which are very far removed from us, from me. You know, I go sometimes and fall onto what Europe wants to do, and I read it wants to involve youth and give people voice. It all sounds very well, very often, and it is written in a very nice language, but very far removed of, if I want to do something, if I want to engage tomorrow, will I have the same opportunity, a Greek or a Dane, within Europe or within Greece also? You see big variations amongst social spheres. So it is just something that I was thinking about while you were speaking, and I think the concept of trust and somehow how does this also translate to how usable are the policies or funding or the Erasmus Plus program. I have met many young people going on these programs, which are fantastic, but does it stop there? You know, do we do this as a European Union here, take some money, have all these nice projects, but what more? You know, because I think we are asking for more.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because that is one of the biggest problems, that we have 27 different countries, 27 different realities, 27 different understandings of what the concept is of the European Union, what we can achieve, how we can progress in this political system, also on the local level, because the EU, I agree with you, that it has to be much more local and much more in the everyday lives. We need to understand that it's not just a concept that decisions are made in Brussels and then we live with the consequences in the very far away borders of Europe. That is not how it works. It's about the daily lives, and all generations need to go together. It's not only the young generation that can change the system. We need a better dialogue across generations and across countries in Europe. I was shocked that nobody ever talks about what happens in Ukraine and the Crim annexation, and that is just on the borders, and that no one insists on continuing the dialogue. And I think it's a part of the trust to the decision makers, but also like media, and we see that with all democracies right now, with journalists, decision makers, media, people in position of power, that there's no trust to the citizens any longer. And we need the link between decision makers and the citizens.
I just wanted to say two things, actually, going back to what you said about this this concerted European approach that we saw during COVID. Just wanted to say that the narrative in Germany was completely different. Like it felt, it was really, everyone was criticizing the EU for being too slow, for not responding at all. There were questions too as like, why is there no European Corona app? Like all these opportunities that the EU had during the crisis. In Germany, it was really the narrative that they didn't take it, and there was, it was really different from what you experienced here, apparently. And then I just wanted to comment, I mean, you mentioned the European Citizens Initiative already, and that's really something that for us at Democracy International is at the core of our work. So we work for more direct democracy, more citizen participation, especially at transnational level. So we were involved in the introduction of the European public sphere, this the European Citizens Initiative. This is something that we've been advocating for a long time. We were also involved in the revision of this instrument, which of course is still far from being perfect. But it's at least one way where you can put items on the agenda of the European Union. And I think this is also something that we think about a lot, what you also mentioned, you know, direct democracy as a way to complement representative democracy, so that we as citizens really get the idea that we can participate in political decision making, also in really like, bottom-up initiatives, and not staying out of politics and only being able to vote. And I think that's also something that relates to what you said, this feeling of powerlessness, this feeling that the European Union is really far away because we don't really have a means of participating. Even with the European Citizens Initiative, it's, of course, agenda setting, a first step, but not decision making. And I think that's something I'm also happy to discuss this in the in the broader circle, but something that would help the European Union a lot if they were brave enough to give citizens more power, so that it's actually fun to get involved and that you have the feeling that you can change something and really take your issues from the local level, which in the end are all political decisions that have been made at some point and that also relate to Europe. We've been talking about this in the discussion already, but to really take these issues that you experience as a citizens on the local level to the European Union so that they can change something and that we also can change something. So
I would like very much to say something to the COVID thing, because we had the same sort of criticism here also. EU does too little, too slow. Why don't they do anything? Now it's important to do something. But then if we look at the facts behind that, if you go to US, then in Atlanta you have the, what is it called, CDC, the health organization of the United States. The headquarters of it, they have many branches in different places. How many people work there? Around 15,000. If we go to the European Union, the Union has a similar thing. It's in Stockholm. They have around 280 employees. And why? Because some governments, especially the Danish, said, health, that's not for the EU. That's for us, the national states, because we know how that is done. So EU, keep out of that. So I just think we need that kind of facts also. It all goes back, yes, we want the union to be more listening, active and so on. But before that, we want the governments to be serious, to decide when they give power, that they give real power. When they don't give power, take the responsibility. And they don't do the first and they don't do the second.
So let's just add another layer to the conversation we need to have about the European Union, and the citizens also have to be engaged in that in order to actually have the right grounds for criticizing or to demand changes to the system. And so today we're discussing fundamental rights, representation, and how to assure the European democracy, especially in times where we can see that is under pressure in many European states, but also on a more global scale, how Europe is to respond to the crisis we faces. Now, is there any more questions?
Can I just give one very short version of that?
Perhaps you could get the mic. Yeah.
First they pee on us, and then they say we smell after.
Oh, thank you for that input. We have a question from the audience.
I was just wondering about the culture, and you're talking a lot about the democracy and unity. And what about culture projects like movies or events like the Eurovision? What are your thoughts about making more and more inclusive culture projects? And what are your thoughts about that?
I think that it's a very interesting point, because what brings us together is not only the political system, that we have decision makers on behalf of every country. It's also, and maybe more, the cultural heritage, our history that combines us, and then what we share in values, and that is not only like fundamental rights, but that is also that we share a cultural heritage. So I think that the narrative about the European Union lacks that we can talk about it with in a more like with feelings and with not always rational arguments, but use it in movies and music and songs and all kinds of art. I'd love to see more art in activism on the European level. I remember to a conference then we were singing Winds of Change with very like almost 25 different accents in English, but it was beautiful and it brought us together in another way than just discussing what should the climate targets be that we can agree on and so on. I know that the EU funds many different projects on the cultural side, but at least in art activism, I miss the part about art and what brings us together there.
We have a small-scale project in New Europe where we just made the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. It has 7 different chapters. We just made those into artworks. And this fall, I think it is, we're gonna have a art caravan in Europe where we're gonna show those. And for those who don't know the fundamental rights, they have to learn it through the art, because that way you can also reach a new audience and have a new way of communicating that is not like legal language or politics and stuff like that, but is actually talking more to the heart than to the mind, perhaps. Yeah. Is there any more questions for this panel about representation, about democracy, about what's going on in Europe right now? I see no hands, I see no faces, but fear not, because you will have your chance to have your voice heard, because what is happening right now is that we actually want to gauge you guys. We want to hear your ideas about how can we support democracy champions, how can we support the conversation about Europe, the fundamental rights, what we want from Europe. And what I really would love to have happening from you guys right now is that you take 30 seconds, 1 minute, talk to the people next to you. Perhaps talk to the people you know if you're comfortable about that, but otherwise talk to new people. And afterwards we will have a shared conversation in this dome about how to strengthen the European democracy. And there's no wrong answers. It could be everything from more art, it could be a stronger sense of representation, a stronger conversation in Europe about these fundamental rights and the values we share. But if you're down with that, that's gonna happen right now. But first of all, I want you to give a big hand for our inspiring panel, Jakob Erde and Marek Assolé.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're gonna take 1 minute, and then it's your turn to be the stars of the audience.
Hi again. Sorry, your name?
Nina.
Nina. I was here with Nina and Maya, and we had a very interesting conversation. So Nina, you were saying about having like a level of European education that is standardized amongst the youth. So, for example, do I understand it correctly? What you so, for example, across all the European countries, when children enter school, there's a package around sexual education, policy, rights. I would assume something standard. And then Maya, here you were saying, for example, that there are many countries still out of the EU that want to join the EU, like Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, that have gone through quite a few conflicts, and Poland and Hungary joined the EU for their own underlying reasons, and the EU also wanted them for their own interests. So somehow the reasons of why Europe, the EU allows countries to join the EU has underlining also reasons that are beyond somehow coming in for rights. So somehow the process is quite different of how they will change, because we speak about progress, but maybe it's a process also that is very individual. And so this is what we spoke about, and yeah, yes. And I will say one more point. I think a lot is around education, and I think it is involving the youth and the children very early on, but for them to have the tools to become active citizens. We see an apathy in the youth quite often, and I think it is I don't know, maybe this is my fantasy, but I think it is increasing.
No, we were just discussing this common education system and the level of education, and seeing what's happening with Hungary and Poland and wherever it's happening. By default, in 20, 30 years' time, generation of people who've grown up during communism are going to die out, and things will get eventually better, yes. But the problem that EU has, in my eyes, I'm a citizen of Denmark. I've been born in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I've lived in London for many years. You know, I've always been a part of Europe, and we've always known that we're on this continent. The problem is the reputation of EU in other countries. And we are talking both Syria, Turkey, or whatever. It's a secluded society. We in Europe are seen as rich, clever, wealthy. nothing else. We are not seen as people who actually understand what's going on. And this is the problem, because if I'm watching Kabul on TV, it's breaking news, and it's breaking news for 3-4 days, and that's it. And this is where Europe is lacking. There is no voice to stand up to whoever it might be, whether it's the US or Russia, China, whoever. There is no voice, because we are trying to find the middle ground, and that happens constantly, and that has no strength. So if European children, if my child, which is a European child, is going to grow up in this society, it needs to have a stronger voice because it deserves it. And we do need to be more likable. We need to be more human instead of being secluded.
Thank you. Okay. I think that's some excellent points. Do you guys want to comment on the educational aspect?
I definitely agree with all the points you made, the three of you, and I think it's super interesting to look at it structurally, because of course it begins with the whole cycle of a life from a small child to elderly, because we take part in the same society still. Why wait until we have the means and the purchase power to become an active capitalist? We're not an active capitalist, we're citizens, and we live in the same continent, we are neighbors, we travel, we live abroad maybe for a couple of months, or we don't, but we are still connected. And for me, the educational system varies too much, and that is in terms of quality, but that is also in terms of representation. We had a talk yesterday where there is clearly discrimination amongst Roman minorities, and then the majority. They go to separate schools, and that is today, and they live in the same country and have the same right on the paper, not in practice. But the educational system we put up forward, and we have separate schools, but that is socio-economic. There's separation in all kinds of perspectives, even in Denmark. No, exactly. So it can be on all kinds of socio-economic, minority, in the intersectional perspective. The list goes on. It's a problem in all the European countries. Anyway, so we put forward a demand for critical thinking and conscious in media consumption for all young people in Europe. And they actually took it forward in the council, this proposal, to ensure that this was taught, because we view that as like the way to navigate in the democratic society, critical thinking, and the way that we consume media. Do you have any comments, Jakob?
No. Only one. I think the EU needs to be as modest as possible and only take on as few things as possible, but then do them very well and in a very clear way, and with a lot of possibility to enforce the rules that are actually made.
Thank you so much. I think that was actually excellent inputs for the conversation. So we're gonna take that with us. You are noting that? Do you guys have anything you can? I think you are.
Oops. Okay, thank you. We had a very interesting conversation, and well, I cannot repeat everything that was said. I just say what crosses my mind. First of all, thank you for your interesting lectures, or I don't know how to say it. I'm one of the old guys. They were talking about old and young. I was a student when the Berlin Wall fell, and this was a very exciting period. And as a student with other friends, we went to Berlin to tear down the wall. This was very vivifying, and at that time we thought everything would change for the better. It was also the time that the apartheid system in South Africa was starting to collapse. So this was a period full of hope. But we realized at that time that Europe was a market-driven system. This was Europe, freedom of movement, yes, for the workers, for the capital, for the goods. there was not much discussion on values. To be clear, there was no discussion on values. But this started after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think. That must be in the period. But there have been really a lot of discussions also on are we going to make a European constitution? But the constitution didn't come along because there was this big discussion on should Christianity be mentioned in this constitution. So talking about values is very interesting, but which values? This is a very difficult topic, I think. And for, I suppose, a lot of people from my age, we see Europe as a market-driven system. And we know that nowadays we talk about values, but we are kind of skeptical. I find I and some other people, I cannot talk for everybody. There's kind of skeptical thinking about Europe and its values, because we know where we came from, we lived it, it's a market-driven system, and you see that the way of thinking on Europe is different between people who are privileged in a socio-economic way and people who are not. And all this stuff crossed my mind. Okay. She also said some things. I can pass the micro?
Okay. Yes. So we were talking about the fact that within Europe, we call it European Union, but in many ways we can see that there is a big diversity within the countries in terms of ideals and in terms of openness, political stances, left and right. And we're talking about how can the EU tackle these problems. So if there's, for example, Hungary, which is very conservative, or Poland, what should the EU as a whole do? Should there be some special procedures that have to be implemented? Maybe some new way of handling and managing this diversity, and some procedure maybe. That's what we were thinking about.
Thank you so much. Do you? Yeah. Of course, this is a public dome.
Because you were saying Hungary was very conservative. I think I've never been to Hungary. I don't know anyone who's Hungarian, but it seems to me that in these countries there is a minority, political minority, that is heard. The majority is actually not heard. So I think that we are mistaking. I think it's much easier to amend this. I actually don't think that they are. Don't think that Orban is majority in Hungary, at the same way as many others are not majority in Poland. You know, if you see the protests in White Russia or whatever it is. So I think it's just who gets the media, who gets the voice out there. I don't think it's that bad.
Thank you so much for that comment as well. I can see Marek, you want to say something?
And to follow up on that, there was a report where you can actually see those conservative movements and anti-LGBT plus, anti-abort, some of the funding to these elitist groups of politicians and their way to power. It's connected to media, but the follow the money, you say, and you can actually see that it comes from elites in the US, and it comes from other places. So actually a lot of the funding to these movements doesn't come from Europe. And that was a shock to me to dive into those numbers and look at what is the structure. How can this happen? I didn't understand it, because that's also what I see from other youngsters in those countries. The majority of them, they want to go another way. And actually you can go all the way, not to like funding and strange concepts, but just straight out. What happened in Brexit? If it was up to the young people, they would have stayed. So I think there's something in the political system that is not shown. It's beneath, and it's funding and it's strange concepts and conspiracies. You can go like down further that lane. But on the other hand, what we know and what we see and what is brought up in the media, there's still missing a gap. There's still resulting in conflicts and people staying oppressed and that is some of the biggest challenges right now. But I believe that, at least for like what you mentioned on, I can't remember. There is trans-European campaigns, and one of the concepts, at least in my activism, is that an attack on those fundamental rights in Poland is also an attack on my rights here in Denmark. So that is how I perceive and proceed and try to reach out, that we are in it together.
Do you have something to add, Ali? No? Okay. Then I just want to finish it up by saying thank you so much for contributing. Thank you so much for taking part of this conversation. I think it's so important that we have these meetings here today and that the citizens are also heard. And I know that our good partners in the European Public Sphere will take your comments, take your points, and bring them forward in their work to try to see if we can strengthen the citizens' voice in the European system as well. So I want to give a big hand to you guys. Thank you so much for coming. And now, if you have 5 minutes, what I would love for you guys to do is, perhaps you've seen these little marks up here, these little notes. These are the dreams and wishes from the people who have visited this dome for how to support the European democracy. Now, what I would encourage you guys to do is like take one of these, and then take a pen, and then write down your wishes on how to support the European democracy in here. And then it's a little wishing well or wishing dome if you like it as well. So thank you so much, and I hope we can continue this conversation.